Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's really wonderful to look around the room and see so many folks I know from practice. At this point, I've been in this job long enough that I know many of you because you're my former students. Many of us have worked together in the clinic. I was joking with someone out in the hallway that sometimes when I hold this event, especially in recent years, it feels a little bit like a wedding reception and that there are tons of people and I want to talk to all of you. Anyway, welcome. It's really great to have you. I'm Kara Horowitz. I'm the executive director of our Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment here at the law school. And we are co-hosting this event today with the California Lawyers Association Environmental Law Section. Is anybody here from CLA, ELS? I know I saw Tom in the room and Marissa, so welcome. John, thank you. The Emmett Institute was founded more than 15 years ago to think creatively about environmental and climate policy. I think it's fair to say that creative thinking is needed today more than ever in these fields, with decades of environmental and climate policy progress under threat. As we know, California is playing a lead role, a crucial role in exploring effective ways to keep to our path on climate change. So it's really a pleasure to have all of you here today with me and to gather in California, one of the leading voices of the resistance on climate and environmental policy, to have a set of important conversations. I'm really thrilled to bring you all together today with our roster of fantastic speakers and panelists who include not only academics, but also community advocates, policymakers, journalists, and not one but two heads of utility regulatory bodies to consider some of the most interesting and, in my view, important questions that are being confronted by the environmental and climate policy worlds today. Our topics and our panelists will all tackle issues at the intersection of affordability concerns, which are a real watchword, of course, today in California climate policy, the abundance agenda, and our environmental goals, looking at that intersection in the context of three specific areas. Our first panel will think really hard and deeply about electricity regulation and pricing. Our second panel will address the move away from fossil fuel extraction, infrastructure, and dependence. And our third panel will talk about housing. So with that, I'm happy to invite us to get started. First up is CPUC President John Reynolds, in conversation with my colleague William Boyd, who's faculty co-director of the Emmett Institute and the Michael J. Klein Chair and Professor of Law at UCLA. They're going to have a conversation. I know we're all going to enjoy it, so welcome. Join me in welcoming them.
So thanks, Kara. I'm William Boyd. I'm a professor here at the law school and at the Institute of Environment and Sustainability. Before we get started, though, I do want to acknowledge that yesterday was Kara's birthday, so I think we should all say happy birthday to Kara. And I also want to thank Kara, Heather, the whole team at Emmett, and our co-sponsors for putting on this great event. I teach energy law, and I teach a lot of public utility regulation in my energy law class. So it is a great pleasure to have President John Reynolds here with us this morning as our keynote. President Reynolds has just taken over as president of the California Public Utilities Commission, which is by far and away the most important PUC in the most important state in the country, in the world, in the universe, right? He's not even a month into the job, and here he is, with us here at UCLA. I'm going to provide a brief introduction of President Reynolds, and then I'll pose some questions to him, and so we'll have some back and forth then, and then we'll make some time for some Q&A with the audience. The first question always goes to a student, and there's a glaring couple of lights right now, so it's hard to see, so I can see a few students, so raise your hand. If not, I will call on you. So just this past February, Governor Newsom named John Reynolds as president of the California Public Utility Commission, the CPUC, effective March 9th, 2026. As I said, he's not even a month into the job. President Reynolds had already been serving as a commissioner on the PUC. He was first appointed to the PUC by Governor Newsom in December of 2021, and then he was reappointed the following year. Before that, he served for many years as a CPUC staff member. He also has experience in both public and private sectors as an attorney and policy advisor in the energy, telecommunications, transportation, and water industries. He has done serious rate cases. He has spent a lot of time thinking about the PUCs and their responsibilities. He earned his bachelor's degree from Brown University and a Juris Doctor degree from the University of California, San Francisco College of Law, where he graduated magna cum laude. As I said, he's led various proceedings and rate cases at the PUC and has worked on a huge range of topics, and so we are very fortunate, as I said, to have him here with us today. I do want to just mark this moment, though, to say how lucky we are in California during this particular moment to have a serious, capable, extremely well-qualified person appointed to a very serious government job. Imagine that. So thank you, President Reynolds, for being here, and congratulations on your appointment. I know there's a lot of excitement around the state and around the country for you and what the PUC will do under your leadership. I want to jump into the questions now. I have kind of 5 groups of questions. So the first question, which I think is an obvious one, why do you want this job, right? This is not an easy job, and it's not an easy time to be the president of the PUC. What's special about the California PUC, particularly at this moment when the imperatives of decarbonization and affordability are front and center?
Well, thank you, Professor Boyd. It's wonderful to be here with you all this morning. And that is a very important question, one that I think I'll be asking myself every day for the foreseeable future. But I think one of the fundamental reasons that I'm excited about this job is that we have an agency really of 1,700 serious people who are doing serious work every day, very dedicated to delivering for Californians on the outcomes we're talking about today, affordability and our climate policy, which represent half of our core goals. In addition to affordability and climate policy, we are also responsible for reliability and safety of the systems that we oversee. These are really big jobs, really important infrastructure that really form the backbone of California's economy. We like to brag that we're the 4th largest economy in the world at this point. That economy requires energy, data, water, and transportation. These are all fundamental instrumentalities of how we live modern life today in California. Our job as an agency is to make sure that the entities that we oversee in this space are functioning correctly and delivering good outcomes for Californians. It's a complex space with a lot of different stakeholders and players. It's a high-stakes space where, as an agency, our success and our ability to deliver for California's policy environment and advance the goals that we've been tasked with will demonstrate to the rest of the world what an advanced economy can do in terms of maintaining an affordable power system, an affordable utility system, deliver reliability, protect ourselves from the risks that are posed by these systems in interaction with our changing climate, really forming a fundamental part of California's resiliency to climate change, and doing so while moving to a cleaner and cleaner grid and helping to decarbonize our economy.
And can you say a bit more about your specific goals or objectives at the PUC in implementing California's climate and clean energy agenda?
Absolutely. So those 4 goals we intend to hold in balance, and there are impacts on affordability from our climate policy, from reliability spending, and from safety spending. Within the space of climate policy, the PUC is really where the rubber meets the road for climate policy. It is well and good for a state or any legislative body to say they want to decarbonize the economy, they want 100% clean energy. It is another thing entirely to deliver it. and PUCs are where that delivery happens. We evaluate the needs of the system, and we balance investment in ways that enable developing those clean resources as cost effectively as possible for customers while making sure that we can also keep the lights on. That is a very serious responsibility. It's one that we've developed a lot of structure around. It's one that we hear lots of arguments about from stakeholders who have very specific interests, some stakeholders who have more general interests, from consumer advocates, from environmental groups. And our responsibility is to make sure that we're setting up both compliance mechanisms for clean energy development that will hit the state's goals, and that we're building an investment environment that's going to enable developing transmission to connect new clean resources, and that's going to have our power companies entering into contracts with developers to build those clean resources to meet the climate goals. All of which requires a lot of long-range thinking and questions about what is the most cost-effective way to deliver on the clean energy policy of California's future. We are often talking about investing in 50, 60, 70-year assets, and we want those assets to deliver for the future we're going to confront. So taking a step back and talking a little bit about administrative process, we sit within a family of energy agencies, really. The California Energy Commission, our sister agency, develops a long-term demand forecast. We use that long-term demand forecast to develop our own integrated resource planning process. We basically model the most cost-effective grid to meet our greenhouse gas emissions targets while delivering on our reliability requirements. We then pass that integrated resources plan to the California ISO, our grid operator, who uses it to inform their transmission planning process. So this family of energy bodies has a series of processes that make sure that we are actually building the physical infrastructure that can connect the grid that we expect to see over the coming decades, and do so in a way that meets our climate goals. And then ultimately, developers develop power generating resources. They contract with the load-serving entities that we oversee, whether that's the investor-owned utilities like PG&E or Edison, or community choice aggregators that we see up and down the state, or direct access providers. And so this entire ecosystem needs to function together in order to meet the climate goals for the state. And our fundamental job as an agency is to make sure that we're doing our part to enable the investment that will help us meet those goals.
That's great. So let's zoom out a bit and kind of look at the big picture right now on energy here in the US and around the world. Obviously, there's a lot of attention to the war in Iran and the volatility of oil and gas markets and what this means for affordability, especially gasoline prices. I'm just curious, though, how you see this from your kind of vantage as president of the California PUC, and how it affects the way you think about the need for ongoing investment in clean energy infrastructure and how you're going to balance that with affordability. I mean, you've already gotten into some of that, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on the current moment as well.
Yeah. Because we're really here to talk about energy and climate, I'm not going to focus on necessarily the human costs of the war, but I will talk about the energy consequences. We are sitting here at this moment talking about abundance at a moment when the energy system, which is really the backbone of how we live abundant lives, is facing probably its most serious crisis ever. As a state, I would say that the investments we've been making in clean energy and in preparing ourselves to transition more and more end uses of energy to the electric grid, as opposed to using fossil fuels, particularly gasoline, but we can talk about natural gas as well, which is different. We have abundant sources of natural gas in the United States in a way that changes the market dynamics, and there's a lot to discuss there, and it's a very interesting area of responsibility for the PUC. But preparing ourselves to electrify end uses of energy provides a real opportunity to create an abundant future that depends on our generation of our own power in our own backyard, within the western region of the United States, within our state itself, and has the potential to really protect us from the volatility that we're seeing in global oil markets today. If we can move more of our transportation uses of energy from gasoline and diesel to electricity, that's going to insulate us from global oil markets as the prime way of not just moving people, but also moving goods, and having a huge consequent impact on the logistics of really every component of modern life. Electricity, we are increasingly at a place where we can produce low-cost solar. We live in the Sun Belt, and the technology is there to deliver very low marginal cost electricity. If we can successfully build the grid to rely increasingly on solar, on batteries to move that solar energy around during the day, and on some other resources to kind of fill in the gaps, we have a real opportunity to build an abundant and resilient economy for the future that's not as dependent on the global oil markets.
Let's stay on the question of affordability here, which is obviously a big theme of this symposium, and of course very much on the minds of a lot of people in the country, and particularly electricity affordability. It's becoming a top-tier political issue, was a top-tier political issue in the last elections, will surely be one in the midterms. A lot of attention in some parts of the country, such as the mid-Atlantic states, has been on data centers. That doesn't seem to be as much of an issue here in California right now, in part because our electricity prices are already quite high. So I want to hear from you sort of what does explain the high prices for electricity here in California, and what can the PUC do in trying to control those costs and make electricity more affordable now, today?
There was a time when we used to say that our electricity rates are high and our bills are low. And that is changing in California today. Our mild climate and our energy efficiency efforts really enabled Californians to use less energy than many parts of the country. And as a result, while we have historically had higher rates than much of the country, we were paying lower overall energy bills. That has changed. We're in a world now where rates are very high and bills are increasingly high. Why has that happened? You know, it's hard for me not to point to kind of the two big challenges confronting California energy policy. One is wildfire, and I'll talk some more about that. And the other is rate design and the cost shift that comes from our legacy net energy metering program and the net billing tariff, which are, for those who are not living and breathing California policy every day or energy policy every day, those are our policies around how people get compensated for using rooftop solar, particularly and increasingly rooftop solar and distributed batteries at their homes. I'll talk a bit more about both of those topics. First, wildfire. We have had a sequence of major wildfires throughout the state, including wildfires caused by electric utility infrastructure. That has led to a sequence of both large liabilities that the utilities owe to people who've been harmed by the wildfires, people who've lost loved ones, people who've lost homes. It has also led to continuing immense investment of billions of dollars in wildfire risk reduction on the electric grid. So our investor-owned utilities are spending a lot of money trimming back vegetation away from power lines, hardening power lines either through covered conductor that can withstand contact with vegetation or undergrounding infrastructure in some locations. They've invested in increasingly advanced weather detection throughout the grid, where we now have a pretty granular view of humidity, wind speed, and temperature around the electric infrastructure throughout the state in ways that help target different kinds of mitigations, whether that's inspections or power shutoffs in conditions where winds are high and vegetation is dry. And power shutoffs, proactive power shutoffs have also become a routine part of our mitigation toolkit. They're not entirely popular with the people who suffer the outages that result from proactively shutting off the power, but it is a tool that we are using here in California to reduce the risk that the grid sparks a fire, causing tremendous harm to communities throughout the state. All of those investments cost money, and customers pay for prudent investments. So they pay for the safety investments to reduce the risk of the grid. The risk of the grid is partly the utility infrastructure and its risk of contacting vegetation and sparking a fire, but it's also driven by other factors. It's driven by the increasing climate impacts that California is confronting and the higher wildfire risks from all causes, not simply utility infrastructure, that are changing our landscape. There are also impacts to the risk from really decades of successful fire suppression, leading to denser and denser forests and lots of fuel buildup. Even as there are multiple factors driving wildfire risk in our state, if utility infrastructure sparks the fire, utilities are responsible for the financial consequences of the fire in California's legal regime, and as a consequence, there is a considerable need to reduce the risk that there is any fire from the grid, because you don't necessarily know whether a spark is going to lead to a very large fire or a very small one, and you have to invest a lot of money in order to reduce the risk that there's going to be any fire started. That is a huge cost driver for California, and when you look back to our rates in 2014, 2015, and compare them to our rates today, the investment in wildfire risk reduction and the wildfire liability costs are a huge driver in our rate changes. So that's one topic, and we're going to keep investing in wildfire risk reduction, although we want the utilities to get smarter and smarter about how they invest in wildfire risk reduction and really targeting the right mitigations to the right portions of the grid where the risk is highest. The second big topic that I do want to touch on about why our rates are so high here in California is rate design. NEM and the net billing tariff produce a cost shift. So what essentially happens is if you put a solar system on your roof, you could self-consume that energy. And the way we have historically designed our rates in California, we have been a very volumetric heavy state, meaning we recover almost all of the costs of the grid through our volumetric energy rates. Most of the costs on the grid are fixed. Most of the costs don't vary with how much energy you use. So because we've designed our rates to be so volumetric, by putting solar panels on your rooftop, you can avoid paying for a lot of the fixed costs of the grid under our current rate design construct. That means that the people who don't have solar panels have to pick up that cost. There's no reduction in the fixed costs by virtue of you having solar panels on your roof. Those costs still have to be paid. If you as a solar owner are not paying into those costs, other customers are going to end up covering them. We've estimated that our Public Advocate's Office has estimated the cost shift as roughly $8.5 billion a year. And it grows with every new system that is added to a household throughout California. That is a very consequential portion of the electric bill and is also a contributor to why rates are so high in California today. We have a considerable penetration of distributed solar systems and increasingly solar battery systems as well.
Doesn't the move away from net metering, though, with the new kind of NEM 3.0 net energy metering 3.0 sort of set up, didn't that sort of start to solve that problem going forward? I know the legacy costs are still there, but it seems to me that the new regime is really getting away from the kind of crude, simple net metering that we had for many years toward one where you have really an avoided cost type of calculation, and we can fight about what the right level is, but also a focus on trying to incentivize distributed storage, which is a huge part of California's challenge, but one that the state really is, I think, making great progress on.
I would say it definitely helps, but I would probably characterize it at this stage as if the legacy NEM policy design was really bleeding out the patient, the net billing tariff has slowed the bleeding, but the bleeding is still happening. You could estimate how much cost shift remains under the net billing tariff and still end up with a pretty high portion of the cost shift. And the reason is that even with batteries, a net billing tariff customer, an M3 customer, could self-consume most of their energy production. And self-consumption is still at the retail rate, whereas export is now at a much lower compensation amount, something that much more closely reflects the actual value to the system. So the self-consumption portion remains a considerable cost shift. We've fixed the export cost shift, but we need more policy levers to make sure that self-consumption is appropriately compensated. Yeah. And we have begun that journey with an income graduated fixed charge. So we have now instituted a fixed charge for each of our 3 large investor-owned utilities. We pegged it to the amount that the Sacramento Municipal Utilities District, or SMUD, uses as its fixed charge. I will say that that fixed charge does not cover all of the fixed costs of the electric grid, but it is a modest beginning so that we have the beginnings of a rate structure that can, over time, adjust to reduce that cost shift.
I want to come back to that at the end, but before we do that, I do want to go back to wildfire very quickly and ask, your thoughts on whether we should be moving some of these very substantial costs from ratepayers to taxpayers, and are there other creative ways to think about how to spread some of those costs to avoid the big rate impacts that we're seeing?
Yes, as a utilities regulator, I will always welcome taxpayer funds to support the delivery of utility services. We know that utility bills are a regressive way to fund societal benefits. The utility bill falls disproportionately on lower and middle income customers, and certainly compared to California's progressive taxation system, we are putting more burden on those households to deliver this wildfire risk reduction. So I think there is a very important societal question about how we are allocating these costs using the utility bill, and whether there are some portions of those costs that actually belong on different funding sources that are more progressive. Within the more direct control of the PUC, I think the thing that we can do is really drive the utilities towards really efficient decisions, making better use of data about risk on the grid to target investments in ways that are as cost-effective as possible. It's not going to mean that we don't approve large cost categories, large investments, large projects, but we can push the utilities to move those investments to the highest risk parts of the grid, because we increasingly have a better and better view of where the risk really lies, both in terms of the likelihood and the consequence of sparking catastrophic wildfire.
So I want to get a little wonky here and talk about return on equity, or ROE, or utility profits. And there's been a lot of recent attention in the electricity affordability discussion on return on equity for investor-owned utilities, which are around 10% on average across the country. That's the allowed rate return on equity. The actual return on equity varies. And is often below that, actually. The last few years in California for PG&E and Edison, it's actually been a good bit below that. And of course, it's also important to note that return on equity is a part of the larger rate of return, right? So the cost of debt, cost of equity gives you a weighted average cost of capital, which is your rate of return. But let's focus on return on equity, because a lot of the critics of utilities generally have been arguing that ROEs are too high and that we're essentially moving a lot of money from ratepayers to investors through inflated ROEs. And essentially that PUCs around the country have allowed these returns on equity to creep higher and higher, and that we could ultimately save ratepayers quite a bit of money if PUCs would step in and reduce those ROEs closer to the actual cost of equity, which is sort of the actual cost of attracting capital in the capital markets. The obvious policy question here is how much can or should we lower those ROEs, and how much will this actually save ratepayers? The estimates here vary a lot, right? So they vary basically by an order of magnitude, as far as I can tell, from something on the order of $50 billion to something closer to $7 billion a year, which says to me that we don't really have a good grasp of the problem and the full scope of the problem. But it's an issue, and it's an issue that's sort of not going away, and I think it's one that deserves careful attention and sort of clear thinking. So tell us how you're thinking about this issue here in California and what you think the PUC can or should do about it. Is this actually an area where you see significant potential for reducing rates and improving affordability?
We'll talk first briefly about what we have done, and then maybe a little bit more broadly about the cost of equity. Yeah. Every 3 years, we evaluate the utility cost of capital, including their cost of equity. And in the time between those 3 years, we have some adjustments that are possible, but the fundamental litigation of the utility cost of equity happens every 3 years. We recently decided on our large energy utility cost of capital and reduced the cost of equity by 30 basis points, or about 0.3%. It's a significant reduction, the most significant we've seen in quite some time, which has an impact on the overall revenues and rates that customers are paying. It is certainly not as low as some parties would want, but it is the amount that we felt under the record built before us with financial experts from consumer advocates, from utilities, and from other parties fighting with each other about what the right market to look at is. That's the number that we landed on. It's an improvement for the cost that customers pay for equity, certainly not as much as some have asked for. Thinking more broadly about the argument that states across the country are overinflating costs of equity, at the very least, you would have, I think, a collective action problem, even assuming that that analysis is correct. If any one state were to make an adjustment to the number that such an analysis might think is right, markets have real choices and responses. And they would, if they saw one utility or one state's utilities earning half of the equity returns as the other 49 states, it's going to impact their choices about where to invest, and it's going to impact the credit metrics that follow and the cost of borrowing for utilities across the country. And the markets can be very hard edges. You certainly would not want, as a state, to be in a place where you tried to make service more affordable for customers by reducing the ROE, and you ended up making your state uninvestable and increasing the cost of debt for your utility, and ended up in a spiral of negative financial outcomes that ultimately will impact your customers. And that is something that, as a utilities regulator, you want to be conscious of both the impacts on customers of setting the ROE too high, meaning the utilities get a windfall and your customers are paying more than they should, but also setting the costs of equity too low and having the financial markets respond in ways that impact your customers negatively. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Yeah. We have to solve the collective action problem somehow. Yeah. So I was going to ask you another set of questions around the income graduated fixed charges, but you already addressed that. I do want to give you a chance very briefly if you have anything else you want to say in terms of your priorities or your agenda on affordability. You talked about net metering reform. You talked about the income graduated fixed charges. And then I would like to ask you for any advice you have for young lawyers or soon-to-be lawyers or other practitioners in energy law and policy. How do they actually get your job, I guess? And then we'll take some questions, so get ready with your questions.
Yeah, in terms of priorities, it's really the four fundamentals. It's delivering on our climate policy, it's affordability, reliability, and safety. We've got to do them all. It's challenging to do them together because they impact each other, but that is the work. Advice for soon-to-be lawyers, I would say first, just be curious. I have certainly found that whether I was working on water rate cases, supporting the development of self-driving cars, or working on telecom policy, I learned things along the way, both about the industries I was working on and about the broader landscape of how the regulatory environment interacts with customers, interacts with companies, that proved very useful for this role and for working in the energy space. I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the California PUC is always hiring. We need lawyers and analysts who are going to help us deliver on these fundamental goals and help support Californians' transition to a cleaner economy. It is really an awesome place to work, full of people who are both very enthusiastic about the work and who get to do big things. We have been building clean energy resources at a near record pace for the last few years, and we're going to continue for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, always hiring. You heard it here. Okay, questions. First question goes to a student. Narayan.
Hi, I'm really interested in...
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah, sure. My name is Narayan. I'm one of William's students. I study transportation electrification. And so I'm really interested in electrification of both road and rail transportation. And so I'm wondering what the CPUC can do to drive that forward.
Great question. How do we drive forward rail and road transportation? In some ways, road is probably easier for us to talk about because we've had a pretty developed transportation electrification program around road transportation. I will say that I think the biggest thing we can do in order to support the electrification of transportation is to drive down electricity rates. And I think that's fundamentally going to mean making some real significant changes to rate design. One of the biggest barriers to electrification that is within a PUC's control is the rate that people pay for electricity. And when people are paying 50 cents per kilowatt hour, it's going to be a lot harder for them to choose an electric vehicle than if they were paying 15 cents. And that could be a transformative change. It's one that's going to require some long-term thinking about our rate design. We can also make sure that we're pushing the utilities to make smart investments in the distribution grid that are going to help electrify particularly the medium-duty and heavy-duty sector. And I think this is going to be a really interesting challenge because medium-duty and heavy-duty transportation don't necessarily take place at the same places that we have historically had load growth on the electric grid, particularly when we talk about long-range trucking. Making significant investments in the distribution grid along a highway corridor that doesn't have a major industrial sector it's a different kind of investment the grid has been used to. It, in some ways, looks kind of like data center investment. Not necessarily the same scale at a single site, but similar in that there will be significant needs to upgrade the grid in specific locations that would not otherwise see a lot of investment. So I think we have a lot of work to do to make sure we can support smart investments in the parts of the distribution grid that will be necessary to decarbonize those forms of transportation.
Great. I think we have time for one more question here, right here in the front.
Hi, Melissa Waters, Citizens Climate Lobby.
Here comes a microphone. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Hi, Melissa Waters, Citizens Climate Lobby. So you mentioned about the current system being kind of regressive, and there's a bill in California right now, AB 2508. Are you aware of that much? That's the Public Utilities Public Purpose Programs Fund. That would help make things a little more progressive. Did you have an opinion on that or anything yet? And are you able to weigh in on that?
I have the good fortune of being able to defer to the legislature on whether or not they want to pass any particular bill. I can't say that I remember all of our bills by number. We do have a fair number of bills every year.
We'll take one more right here.
Sure, I have a nice loud voice. It seems to me one issue here is clarity and transparency. On the affordability debates, people talk about the munis. If you talk to people at Edison and others, they say the munis actually cost more. And the munis are exempt from some of the requirements the legislature places on the IOUs. How do we begin to sort that out in our search for affordability?
Yeah, there is definitely a different set of requirements for munis and the IOUs. And I won't jump on my muni friends, who I appreciate also have hard jobs to do and are. I know.
Well, we have the president of the LADWP board right over here, Alan Marks. And he'll be on a later panel, so hold that question for sure. Yeah.
But I will say that one thing as a PUC we're focused on with the investor-owned utilities is the reality that the investor-owned utilities have very, very large service territories, including the vast majority of the high wildfire threat portions of the state. And it's a different challenge than the munis confront. That is certainly not to say that the munis don't have some territory that's high wildfire threat, but it's a much smaller proportion of the physical territory that they are responsible for, and it does change the economics of delivering service to the set of customers that the IOUs serve versus the customers the munis serve.
So I think we have to leave it there. Do we go to a break now, I think? Yeah. We have a break. We're back at 10:30. Please join me in thanking President John Reynolds, President of the CPUC. Thank you so much. I think we can go. Okay, we'll see you at the break. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're amazing.
Thank you for being a great moderator.